This is Melissa. Today I'm going to explain a psychological mystery and thriller film called The Glass House. Spoilers ahead? Watch out and take care. Ruby Baker sneaks back home late at night after watching a slasher film with her friends. The following day, Ruby's parents, Dave and Grace Baker, ask their kids when they went to bed last night. Rhett, Ruby's 11-year-old brother, tells them they slept late. Ruby kicks Rhett under the table and lies that they slept early. That evening, Ruby's parents are celebrating their anniversary at a restaurant. While they toast their marriage and the kids being safe at home, Ruby has a wild night out with her friends. When she arrives home, she's exasperated to see cop cars parked outside her house. Thinking that her parents had called the cops to look for her, she assures the cops that she isn't missing. However, the cops regretfully inform her that her parents were in a car accident. Ruby panics and asks if they're okay. When they don't answer her, Ruby's anxiety overwhelms her, and she faints. Ruby and Rhett look vulnerable and heartbroken throughout their parents' funeral service. During his speech, Rhett breaks down in front of everyone. The Bakers' former neighbors, Terry and Aaron Glass, rush by Rhett's side to console him. Terry helps Rhett by giving a touching speech for Dave and Grace. Ruby listens to this with tears in her eyes. After the service, Ruby is stopped by her uncle, Jack. He offers help to the kids, but Ruby dismisses him since they haven't heard from him in 10 years. He apologizes and explains that sometimes siblings grow apart. She eventually accepts his offer to be polite. At home, Alvin Begleiter, her parents' estate lawyer, informs Ruby that her parents had entrusted the Glasses to take care of them. Her parents also left the siblings with a considerable fortune. Before leaving, he hands Ruby his business card, asking her to trust him. Just then, Terry and Aaron arrive to comfort Ruby. Soon after, Ruby and Rhett arrive at the Glasses' home in Malibu. Ruby and Rhett are amazed by the couple's lavish modern house. When Terry eventually shows them their room, the siblings are disappointed to share a modest room. That evening, Rhett and Ruby argue as they get used to sharing a bedroom. Frustrated, Ruby goes out to the hallway to change her clothes. She stops when she feels that someone's watching her. The following day, Aaron assures Ruby that she'll be safe in a public school. Ruby admits she's more worried about being the new student. Aaron comforts her with a thought that she shares with her patients. During class, Ruby introduces herself self-consciously. When asked why she moved, Ruby hides her pain and simply explains that it was because of an accident. The siblings are surprised to find a game console and new clothes in their room at home. Rhett is ecstatic, but Ruby comments that their parents would freak out about this. Rhett mournfully asks her not to mention their parents, and carries on playing his new games. That evening, Aaron overhears Ruby mocking her schoolmates. She pushes for Ruby to have a new attitude about school. Ruby thinks Aaron intentionally eavesdropped on her, but she agrees with her anyway. After having a vivid nightmare of her parents' accident, Ruby decides to swim in the pool to clear her head. She's startled to see Terry watching her. He reminds Ruby to be quiet because they can hear everything through the glass walls. During class, Ruby gets disturbed by a safety video on drunk driving. At dinner, the Glasses ask her about her driver's ed class, but Ruby gets agitated and walks off. She heads to her bathroom and grabs a pill bottle from her medicine cabinet. To her surprise, Aaron checks in on her. Ruby assures Aaron she's only taking the painkiller for her period cramps. To help, Aaron gives Ruby one of her pills. Ruby finds it odd that Aaron's cabinet is full of pill bottles, but doesn't ask about it. Later that night, Ruby is too sedated to care about Rhett's video games. She wakes up at dawn and witnesses the couple arguing in their bedroom. Terry sees Ruby and closes the curtains. Later that day, a schoolmate asks Ruby about the rumor that she had an academic probation. Ruby tries to be friendly and admits that she got caught passing a plagiarized paper. After their chat, the schoolmate leaves Ruby to go with her friends. Ruby realizes that she doesn't have any friends there. At home, Terry barges in on Ruby while she's doing her homework. He invites her to go with him to a premiere. She tries to decline, but he takes it as a yes. Later, Terry brings Ruby to a restaurant instead. At dinner, he explains to Ruby that what she saw was just a marital issue, and she shouldn't be worried. He adds that it gets lonely being married. Ruby looks uneasy and asks to go home. On their way back, Terry drives dangerously fast. When he sees Ruby bracing herself, he erratically switches lanes and parks on the side of the road. Terry leans uncomfortably close to Ruby, but he assures her that he only wants to buckle her seatbelt. Ruby isn't convinced. At home, Terry warns Ruby again to keep quiet. As she heads to her room, Ruby is stunned to see Erin catatonic with a syringe in her arm. The next day, Ruby visits Mr. Begleiter's office. She reports all the weird things happening to her with the glasses. Mr. Begleiter reminds her that she and Rhett will have nowhere to go if they leave their guardians. Ruby is disappointed and tries to walk out. Reluctantly, Mr. Begleiter tells her he'll try to help. Before leaving, Ruby learns that her parents left $4 million for them. After Ruby's visit, Mr. Begleiter makes a call. That evening, the glasses explain to Ruby that Erin was taking an insulin injection for her diabetes last night. They also address Ruby's strange experience with Terry. They admit that they're hurt by Ruby's distrust. Ruby apologizes, but she's still apprehensive. The following day, Ruby is taking her driver's ed exam. She's still uncoordinated and anxious behind the wheel. After waiting for a long time for the housekeeper, Ruby decides to hitch a ride with Terry instead. When waiting at Terry's office, she inadvertently sees Terry talking to a couple of intimidating men. The men see her watching them and shut the door. She's startled when Terry is slammed against the window by his associates. Later, while exploring the company's garage, Ruby discovers a beat-up Saab that looks like the one her parents drove. A worker tells her it's been there for a couple of months. While heading home, Terry assures Ruby that she shouldn't worry about his associates. She then asks why the housekeeper didn't fetch her earlier. Terry says he fired the maid because she took Ruby somewhere else without permission. Ruby gets anxious that Terry knows she visited Mr. Begleiter. When Terry inputs the passcode for the security lock, Ruby secretly observes him and writes the code on her drawing pad. That night, Terry gets drunk and disturbs Ruby while she's doing a paper on Hamlet. When he leaves, she switches back to reading a news article on her parents' crash. She discovers that her parents were riding a BMW during the accident. She emails Mr. Begleiter, asking him to find out whose BMW her parents were driving that night. Later, Terry finds Ruby asleep in front of her laptop, but her paper has no progress at all. The following day, Ruby is shocked to find her paper completed. Ruby runs up to thank Terry for helping with her paper, but he cryptically replies, "That would be wrong." At school, Ruby meets Nancy Ryan, an inspector with the Department of Social Services. Ryan explains that Mr. Begleiter called her to verify Ruby's claims under the guise of a routine checkup. She instructs Ruby to act as if they've never met during the checkup. Despite her reassurance, Ruby is still anxious about this plan. During the checkup, Terry hurries the inspector, while Erin tries to hide her nervousness. They lead Inspector Ryan to the kids' room, which has been redecorated to look like only Rhett stays there. Another room has been transformed into Ruby's room. When the kids arrive, Erin invites the inspector to meet the children, but Inspector Ryan insists on checking upstairs. When she checks Erin's medicine cabinet, the pill bottles have been cleared out. Later, the inspector asks Rhett how he spends his evenings. He says that he reads after doing his homework. As she's leaving, Inspector Ryan compliments the glasses for providing a wonderful home for the kids. When the adults leave, Ruby confronts Rhett for lying to the inspector. Frustrated, she throws his snack into the trash can. There, she sees a letter from the Westcott School stating how Terry withdrew them from the prestigious school and he collected a refund check of $30,500. Ruby also finds a postcard from their uncle in the trash. Meanwhile, the glasses are relieved to see the inspector leave. When they return, Ruby hides the papers behind her back. Terry drunkenly revisits Ruby while she's doing her homework and teases her about fooling the inspector. As soon as he leaves, she tries to email Mr. Begleiter, but her email account had been closed. That night, Terry is awakened by a phone call from the loan shark. He demands Terry to pay up. Ruby secretly listens to their call through the kitchen phone. Terry explains that he had taken on a silent partner that was skimming cash, but the man isn't interested in his excuses. Just then, Ruby accidentally pushes over a pot, alerting Terry. When he goes to check, Terry finds no one in the kitchen. Unaware that Ruby is hiding nearby, he promises the loan shark that he found a new personal piggy bank and he can give $30,000. But it isn't enough, and the loan shark gives him 2 days before they burn Terry's house with his wife inside. When he hangs up, Terry throws a tantrum. After he leaves, Ruby cleverly saves the loan shark's number. At school, Ruby calls Mr. Begleiter's office. She tells him that she can't get his emails because Terry deleted her email account. Begleiter informs her that BMW was registered under Terry's transit company. Suddenly, Ruby is called to the vice principal's office. The vice principal accuses Ruby of plagiarizing her paper on Hamlet and dismisses her from school. That evening, the Glasses ask Ruby what happened. Ruby tells Aaron to ask Terry, but he insists that Ruby should take personal responsibility. At 4 a.m., Ruby gets out of bed fully dressed and creeps into the living room. By the phone, Ruby sees a brochure for a girls' school. She dials the number on the postcard, but unfortunately learns that her uncle is out of the country. Later, Ruby sneaks inside the Glasses' bedroom and steals Terry's car keys. She then wakes Rhett and tricks him into leaving with her. When they get to the car, Ruby seems nervous about driving. Despite this, she opens the garage door, which wakes up Terry. As they make their escape, Rhett and Ruby get into several near accidents. Rhett realizes he was tricked and whines that he wants to go back. Ruby tries to make Rhett realize that the Glasses have bought him off. When Rhett asks where they're going, Ruby confesses she doesn't know. By chance, they drive into a police blockade where Ruby is asked for her license and registration. They're unnerved when the Glasses arrive to excuse them from the police and bring them back home. On their drive back, Ruby accuses Terry of killing her parents so he can use their trust fund to pay off the loan sharks. She confronts him about the BMW, but he says he loaned it to them as a favor. Terry angrily retorts that she had twisted what happened so she doesn't have to face the fact that her bad behavior had driven her parents to drink that night. Terry threatens that he owns them now. As soon as they get home, Ruby tries to run away. Terry catches her and drags her inside the house. Ruby fights him off, but he overpowers her, threatening that they only need one surviving child. Ruby desperately calls Aaron for help, but she injects the girl with a sedative. Ruby loses consciousness. Soon after, the loan shark calls Terry again asking for the rest of the money. Terry starts giving an excuse, but the loan shark hangs up. The following day, Terry begs for a loan at the bank to renovate the house for the kids. The banker reminds him that they just loaned him money last month. Terry desperately takes out the trust fund document that says he can take out a loan. He claims that the kids are a financial burden, especially when they're enrolled at Westgate. The banker then takes out the document from Westgate, the same one Ruby found in the trash. He's dumbstruck when the banker claims that Terry faxed it to him last week. At the hospital, Aaron tries to order more fentanyl and Demerol, but she's called in to face the medical director. That evening, Rhett tries to wake up Ruby. When she doesn't respond, he worriedly lays beside her. In the Glasses' bedroom, Aaron reveals that she has lost her medical license because of her addiction. Terry blames that they can't pay back the loan due to her condition, but Aaron argues that she became an addict because of what he did. Aaron tries to walk out on Terry, but he pushes her to the wall and intimidates her. Realizing that they're out of drugs for Ruby, he goes out to buy more. Later, Aaron shoots up after watching a video of their vacation with Ruby when she was younger. Soon, Aaron is staggering around the house. The following day, Ruby wakes up to find Aaron beside her, dead. When Terry returns and discovers his wife's body, he's devastated. He then overhears Ruby on the phone, giving out the Glasses' address. Ruby quickly wakes Rhett, and they hide from Terry under the bed. Later, Rhett rushes out the door, but Terry grabs him and drags him back inside. Ruby appears behind Terry and smacks him over the head. Terry catches them before they can escape and locks them in the basement. It doesn't take long for the kids to discover the meshed window there. Meanwhile, Terry is in the garage working on his Jaguar. While Rhett cuts through the mesh, Terry parks the Jaguar right in front of the basement window, then heads back inside. Later, Rhett breaks free, and he finds Terry asleep on the sofa and drunk on vodka. He steals the car keys from Terry and gives them to Ruby. Rhett is convinced that Terry's wasted, but Ruby is still suspicious. Suddenly, Terry gets a visit from Mr. Begleiter. The siblings overhear the lawyer warn Terry that the bank has blocked his guardianship account because of a court investigation. Suddenly, two loan sharks arrive. They intimidate Terry and accuse him of planning to skip town. They think that Aaron gave them a heads up, but it was actually Ruby who informed them that morning. They demand that Terry pay up his loan on the spot. The loan sharks wrongly accuse Mr. Begleiter of being Terry's silent partner, so they stab him. Then they shove Terry out to the parked Jaguar and duct tape his hands. Terry pleads for them to take the Volvo and not the Jaguar. However, when they check, the Volvo's tires have been punctured. With no other option, the loan sharks duct tape Terry's mouth and manhandle him into the Jaguar. When they drive off, Ruby comes out of hiding, dropping the knife she used on the tires. As the loan sharks' cars drive down the highway, Terry nervously watches the speedometer. When the Jaguar hits 70 miles per hour, the loan shark panics as the brakes stop working. The Jaguar accelerates further and bumps into the car that the other loan shark is driving. This sends the other car skidding to the next lane, where it collides with a truck. The Jaguar soon spins out of control until it crashes through a road border and plummets down the side of a cliff. Later, Ruby and Red are picked up by an officer down the highway. They drive past the car wreck that killed one of the loan sharks. A few meters ahead, the officer sees another wreck and checks on it. As the cop investigates, Terry appears behind him and knocks him out. Ruby and Red are stunned when they see Terry staggering towards them, covered in blood. Ruby quickly gets into the driver's seat, while Terry hides a gun behind his back. Thinking of her parents, Ruby runs Terry over. With Terry dead, Ruby and Red get out of the car and hug just as the police arrive. After their ordeal, the siblings visit their parents' grave with their Uncle Jack. He promises that things will be easier from now on and takes them home.